Chapter 56. Ow, ow, ow. Picking herself up off from the ground, Lorelei batted at her eyes and tried to adjust to the low red light that, well, for lack of a better word, seemed to pulsate around her. Guys? Dennis. Both her connection to the fearsome Dark Lord himself and the voices of her friends were silent. But then again, maybe they were just adjusting, too. For the light was distracting and dim, and made staring at anything for too long, or too deeply into the distance painful. As she reached for her wheelchair and realized it had landed far away, Lorelei pursed her lips and listened to the rhythmic spinning of the wheels. There was a music in their rhythm, and it wasn't the same as Star Song, but she felt more than a little smug as her chair righted itself and rolled over.
Mildred might say that too much confidence is dangerous though. Wouldn't she? Something like, do not mistake a moment's reaction to mean anything more than it already is, I suppose.
Her fingers flitted nervously from her hair to her face as Lorelei appraised the obvious. She couldn't see any of her friends, anywhere. Maybe they were lost here. Well, that just meant she'd have to find them. But where was here, exactly? And she was certain she hadn't messed up so badly so as to end up. Well, whatever was creating it, the red light wasn't meant for human eyes to see, not even when they narrowed their gaze and tried to outglare the darkness. Lorelei whispered, and one of the charms she had affixed to her hat sparkled, and cast out tiny fires of light, pale amber and gentle red. The walls were made of something that moved. It was burnt brown, cracked and crimson. She was familiar with the sizzling flesh smell of it, even if only in passing. Back home it had not been uncommon. Where the wallskins broke, whatever shone through moved rapidly in tiny spasms, more mechanical than organic, and gleamed with metal like broken bones. Lorelei took several deep breaths, and refused to let any sort of fear overwhelm her. After all she had seen and been through, after all, this was just another part of the universe. It might not even be something hostile, but first, she'd find her friends. Hands tightening against the handles of her wheelchair, Lorelei rolled cautiously forwards. She expected the ground to squelch beneath her, because it looked for all intents and purposes like bog water that had hardened from an unseasonal summer sun. But it instead made a strange noise that she decided to make a little less frightening by likening it to a tuba. A meaty, greasy, probably disease-laden tuba, but ugh. Frustrated, she nevertheless had a much better view of the place she had found herself. There was no ceiling as far as she could tell, the walls rose like towers into the sky above, and occasionally the distant roar of thunder presaged the coming of jagged lances of electricity. That was odd enough on its own, but, for now it wasn't important. In all directions, the walls eventually seemed to cut her off, and paths branched too often to seem at all reliable. Finally, Lorelei settled on going northwest, because the ground seemed the least tuba-like, there. It wasn't much further that the skein of the floor broke under her, gushing fluids that she was very glad she didn't have to touch. They didn't even come up to her wheels, but...
Hey, Lorelei, you've been pretty quiet. What ya doing?
When she had finally finished swearing, Lorelei was far more red in the face than the eerie fleshy walls, and she could practically hear Dennis' complete refusal to care or apologize in the silence that followed.
Had a tussle in the toilet, sorry not sorry. I was also leading a raid, not that you would know or care. My team's angry too I guess, but that's what they get for relying on me to carry their weight for them.
Dennis.
That's really great, Dennis. I'm glad you at least chose to let me know while I'm rooting around in creepy fleshy water ichor, because for all I know this is someone's giant, clogged up. Hey. Have you noticed our connection is unusually good? Are you in the neighborhood or something? 'Cause if you are you could get me some snacks. Maybe some scones, I had some that were kind of divine.
Lorelei had gone silent though, and not just because Dennis had a way of stopping your sentences where you least expected them. That too, of course, but it was a valid point. Occasionally it wasn't just the distant and horrifying sounds of "Oh, Justice for Sale," Late Bloomers Club, and Dennis' unique taste in games that clouded the microphone, but static or dead space.
Sure, if I make it out of here and find myself near a cute artisan cheese shop and not near a really spooky tunnel, I'll do just that. NRF. How spooky are we talking here?
She beheld the walls closing in around her, creating the false impression of a ceiling where they folded inwards, dripping strange translucent liquid into pools of liquid, which seemed to form screaming faces when the drops brushed against them.
Enough that I wouldn't mind a lot of high explosives.
There was only just enough room for her to press forward. A tiny bubble of light expanded around her and up against the roof as she rolled slightly above the howling puddles. It was probably pointless, but another thing she felt grateful for, all the same.
Ouch. Sounds rough. Glad I'm here in my air-conditioned palatial residence. Feels pretty great. Yeah, well. How's your raid going?
But she could hear Dennis tapping away the keys even before he responded.
Oh, I gave up on those losers. Just trying to figure out where you are. I hate trying to put directions into map software. It's like they know where I live just because I've ordered a lot of delivery, items.
Still, Lorelei couldn't help but smile. Even in this strange, thrumming wasteland, after all, she had friends.
Is there any way you could try to figure out if everyone else is okay, as well?
Dennis Ruff later came back almost instantly.
WTH, Lorelei. Do you think the interwebs are magic or something? I mean, they are, but geez. I don't even know where you are yet. I can't just say where are Lorelei's dumb friends. Are they alive? Beep boop.
But as the passageway stopped throbbing and tapered off, Lorelei saw a huge, far-reaching expanse. Lights, not unlike the beams of golden phosphor back home, flowed down from on high, though there was no sight of any star that might cast them down against the ground. Rivulets of the strange and transparent liquid pooled against the ground, falling into strangely organic drains, where they weren't gathering against the fallen figure and drenching his fine clothes. Leopold lay motionless on the ground, tiny waves pooling just under his mouth and causing to him occasionally cough, expelling water, but not waking.
It seems that Leopold is here. He's out for the count. I'm going to make sure he's alive. What are you doing? Kill him. Kill him.
Ignoring Dennis as she slowly muted the volume on her headset, Lorelei cautiously advanced towards Leopold. His cane was nowhere to be found, but he didn't seem like he had been hurt or anything. How long had he been out of it, and for that matter, had she been unconscious like this, too? She had a feeling, and knew what a proper witch would do when it came to feelings. He was breathing, and after she propped his head up, he wasn't going to take in any water, so. Lorelei removed her shoes and, with some effort, placed her legs against the ground so that the water just ran over her feet. It didn't seem to be acidic or weird or anything but unusually clear water that reacted weirdly to itself. And maybe that was more to do with this place, anyway. She watched his face as the old man twisted and turned, perhaps at the mercy of some unpleasant dream. It wasn't much, but she managed to create something ethereal and insubstantive out of starlight, even though there seemed to be no stars in this place. And despite the fact that he stopped writhing after she placed it against his shoulders, it disappeared moments before he woke. The two cautiously eyed each other for some time. At first he stumbled back, fingers grappling through the water he had woken, but whatever else could be said of Leopold, he seemed to realize the situation soon enough. His eyes clouding, he reached for a cane that wasn't there, and then simply settled for pointing at her.
I will fight you, if I have to. I'm not afraid of you.
Lorelei said brusquely, before he could make any incriminations. His finger continued to waver, then shook, then finally lowered to the damp ground, and Leopold's face with it.
Did you do this? Is this, perhaps some kind of punishment? If so, it has been masterfully carried out. I admit defeat.
He looked absolutely crestfallen, and she wasn't sure what she had said that had caused it, but perhaps it wasn't just her, perhaps it was something else, or perhaps... Even though he didn't recognize the room or the world or wherever they were, that didn't make him harmless. Lorelei had already finished replacing her shoes when next he spoke, some measure of curiosity having returned to his face.
Truly, you've surpassed me entirely to make a world like this, though I cannot say I care much for its decor, aha. I didn't make it.
Lorelei interrupted, brow set. It might be a mistake, but...
Just like you, I found myself here. I think my friends might be here as well, and I'm worried about them. There's no way I trust you, but... if we're both here, confused, there's no reason we need to be enemies.
And I won't leave anyone alone in a place like this. Not now, nor ever. The thought had barely crossed her mind when a bit of the old swagger and arrogance returned to Leopold's face. He had, with quite a bit of difficulty, managed to pull himself from the ground, and approached one of the walls near the tunnel she had come from. With a disgusted expression, he rapped his knuckle against it, the wall pulsated and made a sound like a dying incinerator, which was only slightly more unpleasant than the tuba noises the floor made.
You know, this is probably one of the most pleasant places I've suddenly found myself. Well, about your offer.
Resting his arms against the wall, and keeping his back to her, the old man spoke very slowly.
There's no reason for you to trust me, I'll probably betray you the moment there's a good opportunity.
And then, with an airy and false-tuned chuckle, he turned around with a shrug that was noticeably higher in one shoulder.
But that's no different than the relation between any humans, I suppose. I can think of far worse people to be stuck with. I will accept your offer.
Lorelei smiled, and perhaps because she was genuinely happy, he turned away again, but it didn't matter. The last thing she wanted to do was fight someone in a strange place like this, and perhaps...
So, do you have any bright ideas about what this is? I've got a pretty mysterious and intelligent contact who thinks we might be near one of the other realms.
Deciding that her earlier strategy had at least found her another living being, Lorelei decided to pick another direction, true north. Thankfully, Leopold deferred to her decisions, at least for the moment, and the two trudged through more of the watery slime. Unfortunately, true north turned out to be a slightly dead end, with two further pathways visible, one to the left and the other to the right. Leopold gave a half-hearted nod to the rightmost path, and they tramped towards it, Lorelei glad to see the slime dissipating near what seemed to be more iron grates.
It's possible, I suppose. You may have figured this out by now, but I am hardly a skilled magician. Where a lot of the individuals I have known focus on a very set view of magic, and of the world. Myself included, and it lends itself to blind spots, too. Mania, of a kind.
Around them, the char flesh and metal aesthetic gave way to blemishless black mineral that looked almost like a starless sky. It was very pretty, and part of her wanted nothing more than to chip away at it and take some to study, but that could come later, if at all.
Do you recall anything before you got here? I had just tried to make a routine jump between two places I was familiar with on the island. I didn't feel any weird tug or anything trying to pull me along with it. I just landed here.
Leopold paused, when the light from behind them had faded into its blurry redness, leaving only the faint light from the stars of her hat, swaying around them. Despite himself, the old man was getting the enthusiastic look of one quite younger who had been given a puzzle to solve, the slight and leonine hint of a smile on his face.
That just suggests to me that it wasn't an outside force, at least not one with intent. Perhaps we just found a naturally occurring gap in the mechanics of things, the little seams beyond reality that unravel all too easily. Though, that wouldn't explain why I was quite unconscious, would it?
He paused, shaking his head.
Scratch that, I'm afraid I might have a rather pedestrian explanation. I was asleep at the time.
And his smile waned, just a bit.
Having pleasant dreams. What a rude awakening this has been. You can say that again, I'm not really one for the whole infernal look. At least not without demons that kind of get on your nerves and threaten to ban you from their elite guild servers. I don't know, it quite reminds me of the villainous lair of Dr. Irregulary himself.
Something really bothered her about the statement, and it took Lorelei several minutes to realize just what it was.
Wait. Wasn't it just the brain of the doctor? The comics.
Leopold, who had looked absolutely delighted, managed to perform a complete 180 turn in the span of seconds, frowning deeply.
The comics, HRRMPH. As glad as I am the tale survived in some form, the real tragedy can only be performed as an opera, without actors, without music, without any sense of pathos. You can't really tell me that mere images conveyed Dr. Irregulary's slip into madness like a knife in the gut.
Perhaps it was merely spending too much time around Dennis, or perhaps Lorelei felt that Leopold might have found an unlikely friend there, if he had just take the time to examine what he was saying, but
they had very beautiful art.
And though she wanted to say more, he seemed quite satisfied with her response. More importantly, she felt satisfied with it. There had been a force to the words, over so simple and silly a thing, but it was unbending and inflexible, and for some strange little reason, she couldn't help but think that Mildred might be proud. Little spots of light were forming on the vacuum black surfaces of the walls around them, mostly dots of blue-white arranged into patterns that at first seemed to be some kind of cipher or code, before being revealed to be spores, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, clinging to the stone and occasionally detaching to drift freely in the air. Reflexively, Leopold had handed her something, a very old handkerchief, or perhaps a favor of some kind. It certainly seemed that old, but though it had once held a very beautiful pattern, it had long since faded away. With a shake of her head, Lorelei gently pushed the handkerchief back, extending the faded bubble of light around her companion, who was quite grateful, as the air was now largely overwhelmed by the spores. Harmless or no?
Thank you. I appreciate the offer, but I think it's probably safer to just not touch anything at all, right now. Even though I've got to admit, I'm really curious about this place.
Lorelei offered conversationally, trying not to smile too much. But it was hard not to. Now that the original fear had worn off, she had two goals, a determination to find her friends, if they were here, and then to figure out what this was. For his part, Leopold seemed a little surprised, and perhaps even oddly deferent. Turning away from her to pay particular attention to the tiny jots of blue and white hovering about them, the old man slammed his good arm against the air, out of habit, and looking quite annoyed when his cane didn't tap with it.
It's only natural. I have neither my servants nor any real power, here, I'd be at a loss without your help. And, honestly, I can't exactly blame you for being curious. If it weren't completely devoid of life, I'd call it hellish. But as it is, you don't think people would make it less hellish, and not more? Really?
He fumbled for the second time, looking a little uncertain.
Perhaps. I suppose it's hard to get used to the presence of people, however. It's much easier to acclimate to being alone.
And then they were both silent, as the air popped with spores about them. They were truly beautiful, Lorelei thought, the clouds of white and metallic green they coughed up as they died, looking like fireworks in organic metal. Soon, the tunnel opened up into another huge antechamber, or perhaps more accurately the walls stopped forming an artificial tunnel. Above them, more distant lightning could be seen, but this time without the accompanying thunder, or perhaps false thunder. A huge edifice of featureless grey metal rose from the center of the room, around which curving paths led in all directions, including their own. And where the paths didn't snake, the ground itself opened into huge expanses of open air, the end to which was not apparent. Leopold clucked his tongue, looking as if he desperately wanted to hurl one of the wall-bound growths into the chasms below, but not being quite brave enough to do so. Taking a deep breath, Lorelei braced her hand against the blue light of her tiny spell. then grabbed one of the rooted spores, and threw it. She was able to see his look of surprise and admiration right before they both avidly watched the bright light of the bloom as it fell and fell and fell, finally becoming nothing more than a pinprick of blue-white light in a sea of black.
Never have understood the appeal of things like this. Seems terribly dangerous, relatively easy to escape for magic users such ourselves, or at least you. And what if you hire some clumsy mincing thing who prances around all the time and takes a nasty fall one day? Useless. You happen to have experience with this.
Leopold fumed, but she couldn't help herself. Smiling and laughing quietly, Lorelei rolled up to the huge edifice, which seemed to have a codex of some sort on it, though the writing was... yeah, no way she could make out any of it.
Do you ever?
She began, then pushed on before she lost her own courage.
Have you ever felt that something, either in a dream or in reality, it's trying to show you something? And maybe it's just a momentary thing, a memory that you're too busy to remember in the waking world, or maybe it's like this, weird and alien end.
Leopold was feigning disinterest, but listening all the same.
Somehow, I feel like there's something trying to communicate with us. And I don't know why us, but this just feels. More than anything else it feels.
Her heart grappled for the words her mind couldn't say. It felt sad, it felt more empty than angry, more dead than dangerous. After the initial shock had worn off, the whole complex reminded her of nothing more than what home might have felt like after it had been abandoned of life. Abandoned.
That seems like an awful lot of trouble just to communicate with 3 castaways, doesn't it?
Both she and Leopold started at the sound, Leopold nearly falling into the horrific awning abyss he had panned moments before. Clutching his heart, the old man wheeled around, pointing accusatorily, though it was hard to keep some of that anger as they saw the man who had spoken. He was sitting, legs over the edge and staring into it with his face obscured, though he seemed to be smiling quite broadly.
Not that I have any right to complain. I also like taking the path less traveled. Ahahaha.
Despite his smile, and it was perhaps one of the friendliest smiles she had ever seen, accompanied by a tone as calm and smooth as any that had ever spoken on alarm sirens and missile warnings, his voice was incredibly sad. And more than that.
Have we met before?
The man did not respond, though he did sigh, after a while. Leopold had recovered enough to stammer, gesturing towards the man only for his accusing hand to go straight through him, for where their peculiar visitor began an almost opaque blue light began seemed to be a mystery.
If you're such a good traveler, tell me. Is this the sort of place we're meant to return to? It would be funny, if the one time I didn't fall, a world so ruined was.
Leopold's voice began to waver, but the man shook his head.
What this is, even I don't know. Perhaps I'm here to ruin it myself, perhaps I'm here to ruin everything. Ahahaha.
And if he was, Lorelei had never heard someone so downcast by the idea of their own success. Steeling herself, she rolled close enough to try to seem familiar, and rested her arms against her legs.
If you would like, we could sit here a bit. With a bit of wind, this place would almost be calming, wouldn't it?
And though she wasn't sure, his smile seemed to soften a bit.
You've become a pretty great young woman. I appreciate it, truly. I do. But now isn't the time or the place, I'm afraid. Too much is happening, and me wasting your time here might not be the best of things. Though I feel like I don't even know what that means, anymore. Awa.
Making a strange, slightly petulant noise, the moon-dust-haired man flumped back, laughing.
There's yet hope. There always is. I guess I'll have to reevaluate my role and everything, but... Hey.
His voice became deadly serious.
Remember what you two saw here?
Everything at the corner of her vision began to pop, and to hiss, and to overload with what she felt were static, or spores, or something.
Please.
Then, everything faded entirely. Chapter end.